I'd like to welcome everybody to ICSS Marx. And today we have with us a guest that is going to be really interesting discussion. I think I want to just start by reading the introduction that we normally give with our presentations. So we have, normally what we do is after a few short announcements, after the speaker gives his presentation, we have a few short announcements. And then we will have, after those short announcements, we'll have questions that are taken from the audience that can submit their questions through chat. And we will try and have those questions answered by our speaker. We'll also, just before that, announce the other upcoming sessions that are going to be taking place at future ISS Marx sessions. And if you can submit your questions through the chat by clicking on reactions and raise, I'm sorry, not reaction, just go to the chat and click your question into chat, and those will all go to Alan, and he'll submit those to myself and Dino, who is the speaker today. Keep the questions short and to the point, and we will do our best to get to as many questions as we can. We may have to, combine questions if they are related into one question, but we will try and get to everybody's question. So with that, let me just kind of give all our viewers today a little background on our speaker today. So our speaker is Dustin Guastella. He goes by Dino, and he has written quite a bit and spoken quite a bit on working class issues. He hosts a website or a discussion on working class politics called Center for Working Class Politics on the web. And he is a research associate, director research associate at the Center for Working Class Politics. He is also director of operations for Teamsters Local 623 in Philadelphia. And the introduction to his talk we sent around, but I'll just read it here to give you a background. Immigration has exposed a chasm between the left and the broader working class. Many Marxists defend open borders, while the progressive spectrum opposes all expulsions of the undocumented on moral grounds. There is little daylight between the positions of the Democratic Party, mainstream media, globalist-funded NGOs, and leftists. They often portray immigration restrictions as white supremacist and xenophobic, rather than attempts to limit capital's excesses. Yet opinion polls reveal that over 70% of the working class, including African Americans and Latinos, support limitations on the border and legal deportations of convicted offenders. And they support that due to perceived job loss and wage pressures, crime, and social upheaval in the neighborhoods. Donald Trump has harnessed this popular frustration, further polarizing the battle lines over deportation and immigration. It is time for reevaluation of how leftists understand and advocate a working class perspective on this issue that doesn't ignore their true material interests and capital's role in provoking this crisis. So with that introduction, I'd like to have Dino give us a little bit of background on how you got involved in this subject, both the subject of immigration and the subject of trade union politics. And give us a little bit of your background, and so the audience will understand a little bit of where you're coming from.
Sure. Thank you, Peter, and thanks everybody for having me. I'm excited for the talk, and I'm interested to hear what you all have to say. Yeah, I mean, as you said, Peter, I think Trump sort of exposed this issue as one of the biggest issues that both motivates his support and causes the left to have a really hard time winning over working class people. So my coming to the issue of immigration was basically fueled by the disconnect that I saw in real life. Progressives talk about multiculturalism and a sort of global open society, but many working class people see, especially blue collar workers, is depressed wages as a result of the opening up of the world to a borderless labor market. So thinking through these things, I started looking around and seeing what the response was around the world. And basically, everywhere you look, everywhere in the world, immigration is the issue that right wing populists are winning working class voters on, right? Working class voters do not trust right wing populists to build better welfare states. They don't trust right wing populists on the question of war. They don't trust right wing populists on the question of education or healthcare. They care about right wing populism because of the immigration question. Now, what is the left's response to this? Well, as you said, from the very far left all the way to the most centrist Democrats, the left's response has been basically nothing. There's been no real interrogation of what a left wing immigration regime might look like and how it might benefit working class people. And so we'll talk a bit about that today and what I think we can do and how I think we should think about the issue versus how we currently think about it. Beyond that, as you said, Peter, I'm a trade unionist. I work for Teamsters Local 623 in Philadelphia, which is a warehousing and trucking, primarily warehousing and trucking union, almost all blue collar workers. And I spend my free time, the little free time that I do have, working with the Center for Working Class Politics, which is a research center devoted to thinking through and surveying the attitudes of working class people as they relate to political questions. What we do is basically set up surveys, talk to working class people about the issues of the day, how they feel about them, what they think about them, and how they think the solutions to these problems might be found. And we publish those in regular surveys, sometimes quarterly, sometimes monthly, if we can get them out. So that's a little bit about me, sort of my background and everything like that. And I think as we dive in, we'll talk more about the immigration question.
Right, that's helpful to know. As you may not know, but many of our audience participants have been involved in the labor movement for many years, myself included. As in the steelworkers, 1109 healthcare workers, electrical workers. I worked as an organizer for a number of years and was rank and file machinist for about 10 years or so. So many of us come from that perspective and really are kind of caught on this whole issue of how to adequately address the issue of immigration. And I thought that an article that you wrote was really intriguing, which you wrote in Damage magazine, where you discussed a different take on immigration that the left has taken. That difference was in Italy. You raised the experience of the city of Sesto San Giovanni, which is outside of Milan, and they have always had a tradition of leftist elected officials. Communist Party has been very active in the leading political entity in that city for for decades, since the 1920s. But what has happened, partially the reason is because they have such a strong labor movement there in steel, auto, and heavy industry. But you brought this example up because in 2017 there was a crisis around immigration. I wonder if you could share with us, why you brought up that particular example, and what could we learn from it, and what were the events that you thought were really worth just looking into there.
Right. So Sesto, as you mentioned, is an industrial town outside of Milan. For many decades, it was one of the strongholds of the Italian Communist Party. And for those who don't know, Italy has had a very strong tradition. The Italian Communist Party was historically the strongest communist party in the democratic West. It was by far the largest working class party in the country for a very long time, mainly kept out of power thanks to some agreements between the Christian Democrats and NATO. And through the 1980s, still maintained a massive presence. By the 1990s, the party itself votes to dissolve itself and sort of rebrand as the Democrats, the Democratic Party, and they live on as a center left party. But Sesto was one of the sort of home bases of this party. And during the fascist era, there was lots of strikes and a lot of barricades put up fighting against fascism. And many of the town's residents still have a very fond memory of themselves as partisans of the resistance and fighters against Mussolini. Now, in 2017, for the first time in 70 years, Sesto votes for a right-wing mayor. And the question is, why? How did this happen? And there are basically two answers to that. One, all four of Sesto's major metalworks closed down in the ensuing time between the 1980s and 2017. So the major font of industry dries up, right? After that, especially around Milan, but Italy as a whole becomes, embraces globalization as an economic strategy. And what that means is two things. One, it means that factories are going to continue to drain out of Italy. And two, they are going to open their doors to broader immigration in order to solve both some labor shortages and to import, there's no bones about it, cheap labor. And this happens in Italy as a whole, which sees record numbers of immigration year over year over year. But it especially hits places like Sesto and other small towns, small industrial towns, especially hard. So you have two factors that happen at once. One, the leaving of industry. So good, stable working class jobs with union representation and political representation start to leave Italy in major waves, just like we've seen in the United States. At the same time, you get an influx of cheap labor coming into places like Sesto. You can imagine there's not a lot of jobs around. The average wages start to plummet. And in fact, for the past 15 or 20 years, Sesto's had stagnant to declining wages for the entire working class in the town itself. Naturally, people are very frustrated about this. I think the center left and the left have done almost nothing to address the frustrations that people in places like Sesto have. And here comes a new populist right. And the new populist right says, the solution to your problem is kick out all the immigrants and we'll raise the wages. They win for the first time in 2017. They win the mayoralty. Next, they start to win parliamentary seats. And by now, in 2026, or the 2024 election, I think it was, they became a stronghold of the far right in Italy. So you get a sense that, this is not exactly an unfamiliar story, right? Those of us who are familiar with the politics of Western Europe and the politics of the United States can see exactly how this story looks very similar. The main difference is that Sesto is a town that has both a Gramsci Avenue and a Karl Marx library. And that's the thing I think that's striking about it, right? This is a town that sees itself and has historically seen itself as a very left-wing place and has thought of itself very proudly as a working class left-wing place. And that's completely changed with the way its politics have gone. And so we have to figure out why and how to fix that, how we can sort of win back these workers, and what ways in which the left can respond to the immigration question.
That's, yeah, as you say, it's really not, it's a, very kind of striking example, but on the other hand, it's not really that different from many other examples in Europe that have seen, large amounts of immigration, and it has backfired on some of the Euro, Euro type politicians in Germany and France and elsewhere, and you've seen the rise of the right in the AfD, for example, or in France, the rise of the right and becoming the most popular parties in the country. And they have been excluded up to this point, but it still remains to be seen whether that they will be able to continue in, having a minority party running the country when the vast majority are excluded from
Right.
from rule entirely. And as you know, some of the some of the tactics to try and maintain the status quo in Europe have been, the possibility of basically making certain parties illegal, and that means, whether that be, the AFD, they've proposed just whole scale excluding them from elections whatsoever. It almost reminds you of what some of the reactions were in the United States during the election period when they basically told Colorado that they couldn't vote for Donald Trump. And they used various other mechanisms to try and control the debate and control what can be said, because things really were kind of getting out of the narrative was kind of escaping their control. And you've kind of taken a really different position from a lot of what other leftists have about how to address this issue. And you have said, basically, you say the left abandoned the working class by framing the opposition to immigration as racist or reactionary. So that basically totally polarizes the discussion. So basically, there is no discussion. And you can't even discuss, the question of, are there any material interests that the working class has that it wants to defend or should defend in terms of normalize or putting any restraints on migration in or out, or from other countries or anything, so that you can't even have that debate. And you say basically the left built this as a moral and cultural issue instead of a material one. So what are the material aspects of working class interests that you're talking about here, and how does that play into how you've constructed your approach to immigration?
Right. So the first thing I'll say is, historically, this has not been the case. This is a new phenomenon on the left, to treat immigration as fundamentally a cultural or values question. Historically, most left-wing parties, and indeed the trade union movement everywhere in the world, has treated this purely as an economic question. Whether or not a country can absorb immigration is based on whether or not there are the checks and balances in place to ensure that wages maintain at a certain level, right? The metaphor that I think is appropriate, and as you said, a lot of people on here come out of the labor movement, and I think it should be familiar. The metaphor I think is appropriate is the closed shop. The gold standard of a union agreement is a closed shop agreement. Why? And by that, I mean, for those who aren't familiar, a closed shop agreement means every single person working in this job must be a member of the union. That means that every single person working in the job has the same wages, same benefits, same bargaining power as everyone else. Nobody can make less, nobody can make more, and that's the gold standard in contract bargaining, is to have a closed shop, right? That way, nobody can come in and undermine your wages by the boss paying them less. You can't have a whole class of workers that are unclassified in the contract and therefore making less. This is considered in most of the world, the best way for labor to have leverage over their wages and working conditions. If you can achieve it, you've done a pretty impressive thing. Now, a number of unions in the United States have managed to hold on to their closed shops, including the Teamsters with UPS, and it's a very good thing. Well, there's no good reason to assume that that principle stops at the factory gates, right? The question of labor markets and whether or not wages can maintain is all about regulation. If you have a pool of labor that comes in, and because they are exploited and because they are outside of the traditional legal mechanisms that can protect workers, they are paid less than minimum wage, they are paid less than what the prevailing wage is in the region, and they don't have any protections, right? They can be fired at will, they can be replaced. It's much easier to exploit an immigrant worker than it is to exploit a citizen. Well, as a result of this, what you get is downward pressure on wages. And many liberals have tried to deny this, and I think there's a real problem in trying to claim that this isn't the case, insisting that actually no, because immigrants come in and they create so much value, they create new jobs. That may be true. It may be the case that they create new jobs, but that's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is the prevailing wage. Most workers aren't frustrated that immigrants are taking their jobs. They're frustrated that immigrants are driving wages down. When you actually talk to workers in these areas, they are completely cogent about what's going on. I was talking to a Trump voting asphalt worker once, and he works with a number of undocumented immigrants. And he said to me, look, I have no problem with these guys. I have a great time with them. They're very good guys. I really like them. They work hard. They work harder than a lot of the American workers. And he's like, but the reason that I'm frustrated and the reason that I want a secure border is because these guys work for 1/10 the pay that an American would work for, which drives down the wages and standards in the entire industry. If capitalists can ensure that there is going to be a subclass of worker that will always work for less, then the overall wages are going to collapse. In America, during the 2020 immigration wave, 2021 immigration wave, we saw the wages and standards collapse in construction, manufacturing, and other heavy industries. And that depression of wages corresponds almost directly to a vote for Trump, a vote to say, we have to stop this. It needs to stop. We need to fix it. If the left cannot understand that this is a simple question of labor in, wages down, we will continue to lose on this question. And we have to be able to frame it in a way that says this is not about xenophobia. It is not about racism. It is not about saying that there's something morally, fundamentally, culturally, spiritually wrong with these people coming in. It's about the labor market and what the labor market can bear and whether or not we can keep our wages and standards up to a certain level in order to have decent livelihoods.
All right, so I can accept what you're saying, and I'll pose what you will hear and probably have heard already from the other side, which is, well, okay, wages are being, more workers available to work, and particularly not part of unions, et cetera, will produce whole new markets that are forcing the wages of unionized workers down. But the same type of situation came about when unions were first being organized in the 30s and the Ford plants, when they brought in black workers from the South, and they tried to bring them in as strikebreakers. And of course, the union's response was to try and organize these black workers as well, get them into the union. But it's, this competition, I wouldn't even call it competition, this pitting the underclass of workers against the existing organized class of workers can take on racial tones. And again, the labor movement today is very different than it was when it was first organizing. It is very multicultural, multi-ethnic. Teamsters is that way as well, I'm sure, as the industrial union. So does the issue of race come into the play here when you're trying to defend, existing wages and, Guatemalan or Haitian workers come in with, who are working for far less? How do you respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, the issue of race is definitely coming in because the only people who are talking about immigration in this way are people who want to polarize it on race questions, right? It's the right. And the right has a very vested interest in making this about race and making it about xenophobia and the other being scary and bad, right? That's why the rights appeals have not been exclusively on economic grounds, right? They've been on the question of how these foreigners are somehow subhuman in some profound way. And we've seen that over and over again with Trump and other people of his, political stripes. But that does not mean that that's the only way to talk about this. A. Philip Randolph, who organized the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters in the 19 teens and 20s, and was one of the architects of the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, he had an editorial in the Crisis magazine. I think it was it might have been in the late teens or early 20s, where he made the very provocative argument that the labor movement should not have not one single person through the door until black workers are able to have minimum wage the same as white workers. And he made this case saying it has nothing to do with the place of origin. It has nothing to do with the character of these people. It has to do with the fact that black workers have been used as strike breakers against white workers in the North, and that now we're going to see mainly Chinese workers come in to act as wage suppressors in the South and the West, where Black workers were finally getting a foothold in industries. Randolph made this case, and it was not considered in any way racist. It wasn't considered xenophobic. It wasn't considered crazy. It was considered purely economic. And he made the case over and over again, saying, if we refuse to make sense of immigration as a labor market question, then we're inviting the racists to make their case on race terms. So yeah, race is a huge part of it. But the way that we fix that is for the left to actually take this seriously and talk about it in a way that makes sense, rather than ignore it and stick our heads in the sand and insist that there are only two options: globalized open borders and racist xenophobia. Those are not the only two options on the table. We have to make sense of this in terms of a labor market and democratically regulating our labor market, such that ordinary workers feel that their interests are being taken care of.
Well, my kind of what I take away from what you're saying is that, it is a battle. It's a cultural battle. The right is kind of fanning the flames of race in many ways, but of course, so is the left in the opposite direction. That this is a racial battle by the fascists. They're they're out to just particularly arrest and deport non-white people, and this is a race battle launched by the right wing. Yet at the same time, there is racism among the working class, and you pointed this out in your article recently. You said the only working class we have is the one that actually exists, not the one progressives wish existed. And you said that one critic said we have to stop telling the working class voters that they have the wrong beliefs about immigration, climate, race, gender, democracy, and patriotism. Instead, we should take the workers' questions seriously and treat them with respect and win them over that way. But that's a tall order to, not tell workers that their material interests are irrelevant, yet at the same time, not also encourage or look away when there are cases of racial persecution or racial bias.
Yeah, I think, for those of us who care about the working class and thinking about politics in terms of class, progressives, I think, have a special duty to take seriously the way in which working class people see the world and act upon it. It's surprising to me how many people on the left, even people who consider themselves on the far left, are willing to say, well, sure, but those people are simply wrong. All these people are wrong, right? And not understanding that that attitude, just by its nature, is exactly why many working class people think that the left is completely elitist, completely unwilling to listen to their questions, completely unwilling to listen to their concerns. If you're a political organizer, if you're a labor organizer, the first thing that you need to understand is the people you are trying to organize are not dumb. They have a good sense of what's going on in the world. You may not agree with the way they see things. You may not have the same perspective as them, but to de facto automatically say, well, anybody who voted for Trump or anybody who supports more restrictive borders is already beyond the pale. Well, you're ensuring that you're going to be a permanent minority, right? There's no doubt there's a huge chunk of the working class that has very progressive views on all sorts of issues, and yet still feels that there's a problem with too much of liberal immigration, right? On the other side, there's a huge chunk of workers who have very backward, bigoted views and also feels that there's a huge problem with immigration. Well, the only way that you're going to win those bigoted voters over to maybe change their views is to take seriously their economic concerns, their economic interests. You may never win them over, but those that you can win over, you won't win over by saying everything you say is completely wrong, you have no right to have those opinions, and you're crazy. And too often, I think that's exactly how the left approaches these questions. They see people on the opposite side of the aisle from them, and they find that their views are just morally or culturally or politically abhorrent. And so they turn off their analytical understanding of why somebody might hold these views, and they immediately assume that this person is beyond the pale, completely outside of the realm of reasonable political talk. Well, if you're not talking to them, somebody else is. And probably that person is on the right. So we have a duty, I think, to take seriously what people are saying and to say to ourselves, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe we are the ones who are wrong. Maybe all of our thinking about this question has been wrong by virtue of the fact that we don't think in the same ways as somebody who works as an asphalt worker in Georgia, or as somebody who works as a police officer in Austin, Texas. You know what I mean? These things are, this is how the contemporary working class lives. And the way in which they think is not the same as the way in which analysts think, who have a sort of sky high view of the world. Understanding their concerns and their questions and their interests is absolutely essential if you want to win them over, if you want to win over trust, and if you want to win, political support.
Very good point. And actually, what you describe as, the Brahmin left, as an interesting term you use about these kind of aristocracy of left thinkers that have a certain view of the way the world should be rather than the way it really is. It kind of brings up the question of the difference between what the labor movement needs to do and tries to do, which is to unite all workers, regardless of political viewpoint, regardless of what ethnicity, race, gender, all their different political differences, and unite everybody on the terms of their opposition to capital, to their contest with the ruling class and the corporate elites that are basically governing their world. So that is the unity that the labor movement tries to enhance and build upon. On the other hand, a Marxist may agree with that perspective, but also have a different level of seeing things that has a more ideological perspective on these distinctions, such as the role of the working class. So and that comes to the fore again when you talk about trying to win changes, win types of strategies like legislative, electing people to office. You may have all kinds of different political strategies of how to get there, and they are not all united as they would be in a simple labor movement where everyone is on the same page. We want better wages, working conditions. But in the political world, it's more divided. So how do you actually get from the starting point of working class unity on the shop floor to a political agenda that will include all these different perspectives, from what you described as the kind of maybe backward parts of the working class and people with racial prejudice, or less kind of universal type of perspective. They only concerned about themselves. How do you transform that working class unity into a political agenda?
Yeah, I mean that's the $1 million question, right? And if I had the answer, I don't think I'd be talking to you guys. I'd be, sailing into office with a, giant working class party behind me. But unfortunately, I think the beginning of that is by asking the right questions and thinking through the ways in which I think the left wing project has failed for quite a long time, right? If we can understand that the divide between the working class and the political left has been growing in recent years, then we have to understand that this isn't just a few errant people on either side, a few errant people on the left and a few errant people on in the working class, sort of having a difference of views. There is a structural problem, right? And things are dividing in such a tremendous way and all over the world, not just in the United States and not just in Western Europe, that you have to recognize, okay, there must be something more to the divisions here. And if the left is going to heal that division, we need to rethink much of our program. And I think right now where much of the left is they believe that you could have open borders, a strong welfare state, and all sorts of other goodies from the state redistributed downward from the capitalist class. And maybe there's an economic world in which that could work. But what you have to understand is in order to get those goodies that you want from a stronger welfare state or from redistribution from the rich, in order to get those things, it needs to start by winning over your domestic working class. If you can't win over your domestic working class, you can't win any of those things that you want to see legislatively. You need really large majorities of working class people in order to win anything, right? We know this in the United States barely has any kind of social safety net, but the little bit that we did win was one when masses and masses of working people came together and agreed with the programs of FDR and the New Deal. You can't win the things that you want without winning over the workers that actually you need to win those things. Well, if the workers are consistently telling you that one of their issues is this immigration issue, you have to take it seriously and you have to think about ways of persuading people on that issue. Now, some people say, well, we need to persuade them to become in favor of open borders. I think that's a fool's errand because every time we open and liberalize the borders, you're going to see wages decrease for working class people. So I think you need to try a new approach and think through how can you actually take seriously the question of the border and the question of the labor market without going into the xenophobic, without going into the negative and racist ways that I think the far right has done. We don't have to do that. What we do need to do is take seriously the border and take seriously the question of the labor market. If we can do that, and if we can create a more restrictive immigration policy that actually respects the wishes of working people, then they will be won over on other things. We'll have won trust on other things that we want to see happen. So I think it's possible, but I think it's like anything else, it's a lot of hard work.
Okay. So you have raised a couple of examples of other countries that you feel have actually made some progress on this immigration issue. I mean, approached in a different way than the kind of contentious and polarized way that it's done in the United States. And I think those were, you mentioned both Mexico and Denmark, I believe. But why don't you give us your take on, possibilities, not necessarily countries that have solved the problem, but at least a different take and how you think these countries might provide some kind of a perspective for us today.
Right. So it's not just immigration, right? And I tried to get this across in the essay. What workers are frustrated with, and there is a real problem here, is the overglobalized economy. Since the 1970s or so, with the financialization of the economy, we've created an incredibly overly interconnected global economy. That has led to both deindustrialization and excess immigration. The extreme movement of both capital and labor over these past 50 years or so has created both a kind of frenetic race downward in terms of wages and also a tremendous instability in labor markets and social life in general. All over the world, this is being felt in really dramatic ways. And the reason I highlighted Mexico and Denmark is because it's being felt in completely opposite ways in these countries. In Mexico, for instance, they are a net exporter of labor. That is, more people leave that country than come to it. Denmark is the complete opposite. Denmark is a net importer of labor. More people are trying to get into Denmark to work than are trying to leave Denmark. Yet both of these countries have realized, both with center-left governments at their helm, although very unique center-left governments, because they're the only center-left governments in the world right now that have managed to hold on to their industrial working class as their main voting bloc. So both the Danish Social Democrats and Morena in Mexico are the only parties in the world that have not lost a huge chunk of their working class to the right. So they must be doing something right. Part of their argument, part of the pitch that they have made to their domestic working class is we are overextended. We are overly open right now, both in terms of the labor that we are sending abroad, the labor that is coming in, and the finance that is sort of washing over us and moving in and out of our country without any real say. They've criticized the multinationals, globalization, and immigration in one term, right? It is not you have immigration as one discrete issue and everything else is over here. All of these things are wrapped together in their argument. The reason that we are frustrated, they say, is because the nature of global finance has broken down the barriers of all sovereignty in basically every country in the world, save maybe the United States, which is sort of the big backer of the global financial class. If that's the case, then the program to repatriate and rebring sovereignty back home needs to be as holistic. It needs to say, we will take a new way of looking at the economy. That is to say, we're going to put political economy back into the hands of democratic states. We're going to pull it downward from the global financial elites and democratically get it back under the control of sovereign states. This, I think, is the first step to actually reimagining what the economy can look like in all of these countries. Without doing that, you have no control over your domestic economy. You have no way of planning anything. You have no way of actually railing in some of the capitalists who have fled and who have even stronger power by being trans-global than they do if they were stuck to their own nation state. So this is the beginning of these things. I don't have a bullet point, here are the 10 policies that need to be implemented. But philosophically, we have to realize that part of the problem right now, part of the crisis globally, is an overextended globalized economy. And the only way to bring that back down is to make a case that ties all of these things together and to say that we're going to re-express sovereignty over the domestic economy in order to provide a better domestic working life for our own working class. That is the first step to internationalism, and it's the first step to actually fixing what's wrong in the economy.
So that's an interesting definition of internationalism, which, of course, that's a current item of debate among the left now. What is internationalism? Before we continue with this discussion, I want to just remind viewers, people listening to us, to please submit your questions to chat, and we'll have those handled by our moderators, and we'll try and answer everybody's question that gets submitted to chat. And because we have so many questions and so many viewers that we're going to need to manage this through chat. So thank you very much for that. To get back to internationalism, I mean, it is. I noticed you did bring up the question of national sovereignty. So that really is kind of particularly in Europe, a really critical debate right now is sovereignty over, do you have sovereignty over your nation because of the EU's ability to basically mandate all kinds of policy among all their members, where often some of these members, Hungary or other Slovakia rather, or some of the other countries resist the mandates of the EU directors and try and put limits on immigration. And there's been a great debate over this. And you raise sovereignty as a way of trying to address this. But here's my question. Sovereignty is a national policy decided by the ruling class of each nation, of course. I don't think anybody has ever asked a union or union worker what should be the sovereignty of the United States. Please tell us what it should be. How should we run our nation? So I'm wondering, how do you? I understand the intent of what you're trying to bring forward, that if there is true democracy among working class people, they will have a say over national sovereignty. They will have some way of implementing policies that protect their financial and material interests. But again, sovereignty is a class issue, really. So how do you get to the point of making the debate on sovereignty a debate over class interests?
Right. So the way I'll put it is this. I think in the era of globalism, that is to say, when we've sort of, the financial class in particular, has done away with the fact that national governments can really control what their domestic economies look like. And I think we can all agree that this is we're deep in that era. Both the EU, but not only the EU, the World Trade Organization and other trade organizations have insisted upon the remaking of national economies away from whatever their economic strategy may have been, developmentalism for many Latin American countries, or some form of industrial support for more advanced countries. If the globalism has erased that, and what we have now is sort of edicts from on high on how every country should be more open, more global, more free trade, more free finance, free movement of capital. This has created a situation where sovereignty is now a tool in the toolbox of domestic working class, if they can wield it, if they can wield it. And I think the reason that right populists have succeeded in yielding that tool is because domestic workers know that their national governments can have some say over the economic strategy, but that the global elite have prevented their national governments from having that say. If the left wants to take up this argument, and I think they should, the way I think about sovereignty is that the national democratic, the domestic democratic process, which can influence economic policy outcomes, can only work if those economic policy outcomes are able to be implemented in their national context. If you cannot do that, it doesn't matter if you try to change the policies of your national country, because the World Trade Organization or the EU or some other global entity will come down and say, no, you can't do that. Or just Wall Street will tell you, no, you can't do that. You're not allowed. In order for us to reclaim the debate about democracy, especially about working class democracy, we need to take seriously the idea of national sovereignty. There is no, right now, example of international democracy, right? Every example of international organization that working class people have actually seen in action has been anti-democratic and elitist, the EU being the worst offender of this. Therefore, I think the way I think about it is globalism took the national economies in a direction. We have to kind of scale back to where there was a decision point in order to take it in a new direction, a new international direction. But until we can scale back to that point where we can say, no, we actually do have some say over our national economy. We do have some say. And citizens, working class voters, can have say in their national economies, even if it's modest. Then I think people will start to take seriously the idea that you can reorganize the economy in a meaningful way. But if you say, look, there's nothing we can do, the global elites tell us what to do domestically, and we just go along with what they say, all that's going to do is fuel cynicism among working class people who will say, it doesn't matter what you do, because ultimately Wall Street or the financial class or the EU or whoever are going to overrule anything that you want to do. And then you'll have, again, the right saying, that's not true. We over here can stop Wall Street. We over here can stop the EU. And that's exactly what they've been doing in Europe, right? If you listen to the right-wingers and their argument, it's always about how the EU elites, the city in London, Wall Street, the financial class, they talk about this all the time. Now, we all know that they have no real intention of doing anything about it, but they know that if they talk about it, they will win votes. The left, however, has, I think, left the field to the right. And you never hear many people on the left combine these issues to say, in fact, the problem of Wall Street, the problem of finance, the problem of globalism is the problem of sovereignty, is the problem of the decreased control that workers have over their national governments. And we, on the left, want to increase your control over your national government. And so what we want to do is reduce the level of overconnectedness to the global economy and reintroduce the idea of a left-wing sovereignty, that the democratic people, the small d democratic people of the country, get to decide the outcome of its nation.
Okay, well, I do certainly see that in Europe, that the right wing is raising these issues, and they have overwhelming support, particularly in Germany, overwhelming support of the majority of the population on this particular issue of mandates by the EU and inability to control their own nation, their own energy supply, war with Ukraine, all these issues they have no control over, and they have the support of the majority of the population. However, you question whether they will actually do anything if they come to power. I don't know. That's an interesting question. And it really kind of raises the issue of United States is entirely different political framework than the rest of Europe or many other countries in the world, where you have working class parties, contention on national issues by leftist parties or working class parties. It does not exist in the United States. So, as a Teamster yourself, and as a viewer or a follower of some really interesting trade union politics over the last presidential election with the Teamsters, how does a national working class political perspective get brought to the fore in America? There is. Do you see a requirement for a working class party to be built? Do you see maybe trade unionists themselves in some formation having a political platform or political way to force their issues onto the national agenda? I'm just not sure how this actually happens without a working class or leftist party per se, or a communist or socialist party that can actually bring these issues to the national debate. How does it happen? And have you seen the prospect of something that happening within your own, union movement or other unions?
Yeah, I mean, I would love to see a Labor Party, a working class party that advocated for the interests of the working class squarely and straightforwardly. I think it takes a lot to get from here to there. So in the medium term, what I think is important right now, and what I spend a lot of work thinking about, is how we can get working class people to actually run for office as independents if needed, but more so philosophically as populists, as people who believe that there's something fundamentally broken in the economy, and that the only people who are going to be able to fix that are working class people themselves sticking up for their own interests. So the first step to that, every labor party in the world has always started with the argument that working class people deserve some political representation. Well, in the United States, only about 2% of Congress have ever come from a working class background. In fact, in the 10,000 elections to House seats since our history began in 1789, no two working class people have ever been elected to the same seat. Two lawyers have been elected over and over and over again. Professors have been elected back to back. Professionals, businessmen, all sorts of other types of people, all from mainly the upper echelons of the class ladder, have been elected back to back to back to back to back, but no two working class people have ever been elected back to back in the United States Congress. If you want to make a dent, and if you want to actually get us on the road to some sort of politics that thinks seriously about the role of the working class and the way in which the working class interests need to be expressed politically, it's going to start with working class people themselves organizing for elections in order to actually express their own interests. So I think that begins with a lot of populist candidates who are willing to run for office and willing to make these arguments against the arguments that are being made by both parties. And whether they run as Democrats, whether they run as independents, that depends on, I think, the political context. But the key is that they are going to run on a clear working class agenda, one that speaks to the voters in that district, and one that challenges the major parties' assumptions about the world. If we can do that, and if we can succeed, I think that is the first steps towards something greater and something better.
Okay, so I guess I'm hearing that ideally a working class party in the electoral arena is what is needed. We have some state and local and a few national positions contested by DSA and occasionally Green Party and others. Some have won, particularly in New York. This most recent election was pretty groundbreaking in terms of the winning someone from the DSA to mayor of New York. And we're seeing kind of I wouldn't say backtracking, but certainly some of the issues of trying to negotiate with the Democratic Party if you're on the left. They certainly, um, it's an uphill battle, of course, to try and win any kind of concessions from Republicans or Democrats. So I guess, when you were thinking of that, uh, is it really, the role of just individuals, running their own campaigns that's going to make a difference, or is it an organization behind them that really makes a difference? Has the Teamsters actually run anybody for office that have won and have made a difference, or is there are the unions actually capable of making a real impact even in the electoral arena in the United States, which of course, as we know, it's a whole different ball game. It's not really a party
Right.
contest in the United States per se, like it is in other countries. So, what have Teamsters or other locals actually done that you've seen be successful in that regard?
So I think to your larger question, where is the energy going to come from? I think the labor movement has to play a critical, if not the critical and catalyzing role. Organizations like DSA and other organizations like them they do really impressive things with what numbers they have and what little resources they have. But the fact is that the real base of any kind of working class party sort of has to start with the labor movement. I just don't see any other way in which working class political organization can sustain itself without something like mobilized, politically active working class trade union movement. Now, what can unions do? Well, the main thing that unions can do, and we're starting to see some of this, is actually take seriously the idea of running their own candidates, which is not something, believe it or not, many unions do. Most unions simply look at who's on offer and give money and endorsements to those candidates that are already running, right? More and more, I think the labor movement needs to put its investment in saying, look, we have a tranche of really great talent among the working class that can run for elections, and that being from the working class and being sponsored by the trade union movement will have much less incentive to immediately pull to the right or pull to the center on economic questions, because they will know that the reason that they are there, the reason that they've been sent to a state house or Washington, is to actually fulfill the interests of the working class legislatively. So that's, I think, the first thing. I think you need to have the unions invest even more in trying to find candidates of their own to run, and have those candidates be competitive in elections where Democrats and Republicans are both running. If you can do that, then you have the beginning of what could be a real labor's real political program. Several unions have done this, and several unions have been scaling up their operations to do more of it. Whether or not it can be successful legislatively in large scale, as you say, the United States is a real beast of a political animal. But there's sometimes too much cynicism about how dynamic the American political system can be. Yes, we have, the way the system is set up has militated against the kind of mass political parties that you see in Europe, but it has not militated against certain outcomes that have benefited working class people, right? When there were the great populist currents of the 1920s and 30s, American populism in the South, the labor movement in the industrial North, and the left-wing movements of the socialists and communists along the Northeast corridor, what was the outcome of this? Well, it was the New Deal. There was no question that there was a translation of genuine working class political movement into legislative achievements. That it is undoubtedly true that that happened. That suggests that the American party system, while it looks incredibly inert, can actually absorb a lot of dynamic changes and do things that you may be surprised to see. Before the New Deal, right, where were the progressives? They were almost exclusively in the Republican Party. After the New Deal, almost all of them are in the Democratic Party. No one would have predicted that that would have been possible before the New Deal happened. And yet, this was the outcome of a tremendous amount of struggle and a tremendous amount of political activity both by the unions themselves and by independent populist movements that developed throughout that time. Right, you had the Townshendites in the West Coast, you had the Huey Long movement in the South, and you had all of the socialists. Norman Thomas was the sort of standard bearer for the socialists, and you had a very strong communist movement. All of those things came together to produce real pressure on the administration in charge to make some changes. And they did. And so I think America is not going to look like the rise of the Social Democratic Party in Germany, right? Where it's sort of brick after brick after brick. Suddenly you get a giant mass party and it becomes half of the government, right? And it's a very programmatic and ideological party that has these, really strong understanding of itself and its members and democratic cooperation all the way throughout. I don't think the United States, American politics is ever going to look like that. It's just we're not built in the same way as a country, both culturally and institutionally. It's just not the way politics works here. But that doesn't mean that populist currents can't affect the outcome of what goes on in Washington. And those populist currents, I think, need to be able to have a political candidates that are capable of winning against both the sort of mainstream of the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. If they can do that, whether or not they run as a Democrat or Republican or an independent, they will be able to influence the outcome of policies in Washington.
Great. And that is really true that the labor movement, particularly and leftist movement in the 30s, had significant impact. They had the, labor legislation, social welfare legislation, all these things. Many of them, of course, were actually reinforced as a policy in order to bring some kind of peace to the labor movement, industrial peace, which was being disturbed by continual sit-down strikes and et cetera. So it's an interesting question. Who is leading this? Is it really the working class causing these changes in policy, or is it capitalists looking for advantages in setting social policy that might at the same time benefit the working class? But in a way, it really doesn't matter if these policies are an improvement in the working class conditions. So interesting point. We're already over an hour, and I want to break to make a couple of announcements. And when we're done with the break, I'm going to come back and we're going to pose to you some of the questions our listeners have been just dying to get answered and discussed. So let me break now and make a couple of announcements. We had a speaker for next Sunday, the 15th, who unfortunately just ran into a illness that will prevent the speaker from coming, and we're trying to arrange another interim speaker for next Sunday. So stay tuned, and that'll be in your email coming this week to announce who will be here on next Sunday. On the 22nd, we have a speaker, Amit Singh, who will be speaking on reflections on the contradictions in China based on traveling in Chinese cities. Amit Singh has a PhD in, looks like in mechanics from University of Minnesota, Twin Cities, and he is currently on the faculty of IIT Bombay, India. And he has done a trip to China where he's going to share with us all the things that his perceptions and interesting anecdotes of the political situation in China. So it'll be very interesting. I hope you all tune in then. I want to remind everybody too to please go to our website, pledge a little bit of a donation to keep this series going. We always appreciate any donations we can get. We do have expenses, so please join by supporting us there on the website, ICSS-marks.org. With that, let's jump back in with Dino and see what he has to say to our listeners' questions. So the first question is that the talk assumes that if the foreign workers are limited and the labor market is left to national workers, due to market forces, the wages may recover. However, capitalists have other methods to pressure wages down. They move factories abroad. They speed up. They have automation. They have all kinds of methods to reduce wages and reduce jobs. So the argument of controlling the market within current conditions will not work in a globalized capitalist world. In other words, we're dealing here not simply with a with one policy that will solve one policy change that will solve the question of wages and jobs. So is it really realistic to address these particular problems from the perspective of migration only, which is
No, I agree with, I think, the spirit of the question that this cannot be the solution to the problem of wages. But I will turn things around in another way and say, if we were to have, one, like as I said at the end of the sort of last remarks, I think this needs to be a holistic attack on an overly globalized economy. So I don't think that immigration can stand alone as a way to solve the wage crisis. But on the flip side, I don't think that there is any meaningful way that you can have some rational planning over your economy without confronting this problem. I mean, let's imagine in, a better world, we had a democratic say over both industrial policy, genuine democratic say over industrial policy, over wage setting, and other, huge economic issues that come up. And we were able to say, no, America has transformed into a much more democratic economy than it has ever existed before. We're able to vote on wage setting every year, every 4 years. We're able to vote on the investments in major industries and what we want to invest in. We're able to actually use sovereign wealth in a way that can benefit the welfare of the people, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The question then becomes, okay, let's imagine that that is the case. This is the best possible case scenario. Would we not have a restrictive immigration program under such conditions? Would we not say that there is a democratic say over who is and isn't allowed to be a participant in that democratic economy? It'd be very hard to say we're going to have a democratic say over all these forms of economic decision making, except for this one. This one we're going to leave to just total market anarchy. This one we're going to say anybody can come in, anybody can go out. It's a free for all. We would say no, that doesn't make any sense. There has to be some rationalization to these questions. And so to people who say, oh, you can't fix it, giving up to that cynicism says, well, you can't do, then you're leaving everything to the market, in my opinion. You have to make sense of how you're going to democratically run any kind of economy. Part of that is going to be the labor question. Part of that means regulating immigration.
do you see, to follow up with that, do you see any way of addressing the international aspects of immigration? In other words, the tendency of capital to destroy economies in Latin America, maybe not even intentionally, but basically through automation, through productivity gains to force, which is forcing, peasants and farmers off their land into the cities, looking for jobs, therefore, trying to migrate north to find jobs in the US. I mean, this is not simply a national policy question that the US has to solve. It's really an international question, an international economy that's totally tied together with all these other Latin American economies. How do you address?
In the 1950s and 60s, there was a path not taken in the United States in terms of industrial policy. And the path that was not taken was to say we are going to intentionally build up infrastructure in Latin America. And the idea was the United States, both as a show of goodwill and also as an economic program, should invest a boatload of money in trying to rebuild and build new infrastructure all throughout Latin America. The idea here was basically, look, we need to spend a lot of money in these countries if they're going to develop in a way that they are not going to constantly feel the need to move northward, right? If they're going to have decent economies of their own, the investment needs to come from somewhere. Well, the investment ought to come from the United States, especially because the United States had played such a role in suppressing the development of many of those countries. That path wasn't taken. Instead, obviously the American elite said that would be a waste of money. Obviously, we did something very similar for Europe after World War II, where we spent a tremendous amount of money to rebuild infrastructure and to develop those countries back into being democratic and industrial societies. As a result of that, I think it's not surprising that we didn't have mass immigration from Western Europe in the 1960s, right? Because Europe was able to be rebuilt on tremendous amounts of investment from the United States. The way I think about fixing the global economy is in a similar way, right? The American investment can actually be a force for good if it's used in that way. It's no wonder that the Chinese are doing a very similar thing right now. Their diplomacy right now is through developmental projects. They're building and they're investing in huge infrastructure projects all over the world. It's not out of a selflessness, right? Partly this is part of the economic program of the Chinese government. They understand that in order to develop and export steel, they're going to need countries that have needs for steel. In order to do that, they need to spend a lot of money developing those countries. There's no question that the United States could play the same game. And basically, all rich countries ought to, because the only way to develop the poor countries into countries that can be self-sustaining is if the investment comes from elsewhere. Many of these countries simply don't have the investment domestically in order to completely reform their infrastructure systems. They need outside investment. Well, that outside investment can come in the form of predatory finance capital, or could come in the form of genuine diplomatic goodwill on the part of nations that actually have an interest in those countries being developed. So yes, you can't just solve it by closing the border and saying tough luck. You need a concomitant foreign economic policy, something that we haven't had in 50 or 60 years, to actually develop these countries in order that there's a reason and a right to stay at home.
Okay, yeah, I take that message, but on the other hand, investment in a lot of these countries does precisely what we've just been discussing. It depopulates rural areas, and if you invest, you often eliminate jobs rather than create new ones. So it's a double-edged sword. We've seen, of course, both in the United States and Latin America. Let me follow up with another question by another viewer, which this raises an interesting dilemma in the argument against or the argument for limiting immigration to certain types of work. The viewer says immigrants take low-income jobs like field work and housekeeping, not the industrial jobs that white workers want. So how would deporting these people help white workers? Of course, there's a lot of subtext in there. So I'll let you answer that.
First of all, it's not true. The idea that immigrants only take jobs that no domestic workers would want is not, economically true. We've seen the fact that many jobs in construction, jobs that we understand are high wage jobs, were affected dramatically by suppressions in wages because there was a tremendous amount of highly exploited low wage labor. The second part of the question, and this is the one that seems to always strike me as odd, is people say, oh, well, immigrants do the worst labor in the United States. They are the ones in the fields. Well, that's the problem. That's precisely the problem. The fact that we have a reserve army of effectively unwaged workers is the problem that we are trying to solve. To consistently say, no, actually, it's fine to have people making 10, 20 cents an hour working in the fields is part of the problem. And I'll put another thing forward. Trump actually, against the United Farm Workers, there was a huge outcry from the United Farm Workers. Trump actually opened the guest worker program in California to an unlimited amount of workers. The reason he did this is because he wanted to drive down grocery prices. This was almost nowhere in the national news. On the one hand, he's in Minneapolis causing all sorts of trouble, trying to make a big stink about ICE and showing people that he's deporting people. On the other hand, he's opening the back door to an unlimited number of guest workers. What guest workers are, and he's changed the rules so that they can be paid less than the minimum wage and that they don't have to be paid room and board. This means, on the one hand, he's making a show of deporting workers, and on the other hand, he's importing a ton of wage-suppressing workers. It was the United Farm Workers, the very people who do pick our lettuce and our fruits and vegetables. The United Farm Workers was completely opposed to this, and they said this is going to suppress wages across the board. Almost nobody came out and said, there is a problem here. There is a problem with opening up the guest worker program and driving down the wages. I didn't see any Democrats even talk about it. It was barely in the news. And yet, this is exactly what we're seeing in our farms. So the idea that, well, only the poorest immigrants take only the worst jobs in the world, that's part of the problem. We need to fix that. It is not the case that you can have an underclass of workers in an economy like ours and insist that they should just stay there as an underclass. They can't. There must be both a path to citizenship for them so that they can actually make decent wages and a regulation of the labor market so they're not suppressing wages across the board.
Okay, here's another contrary view, disputing some of the premises that we've been talking about. The question is, there is not a globalism problem, there is an American imperialism problem. The working class did not follow FDR, but FDR reluctantly had to give concessions to the working class to save capitalism. Why don't unions try to organize immigrants? Okay,
It's
that's
have
the
tried to organize immigrants. I mean, I don't think that immigrants are unorganizable, but I think that the case that needs to be made is in in the United States right now, there are very few organizing drives that are capable of actually organizing the mass of American workers. Right? If the labor movement had its ducks in a row, Amazon would be an organized shop. Right? Amazon would be a union shop where people actually made decent wages. That's not the case right now. The argument that the labor movement is going to be able to organize all of the undocumented immigrants in the country in order to stop wage suppression is, it's just such a tall task that it seems really difficult to imagine when the labor movement can't even stop itself from shrinking every year from attrition. So to argue that the only way out of this is, continuing to have open borders, but to organize all the workers that come in, I mean, I think it's a fool's errand.
Okay, very well. I should also mention, of course, that many unions actually are organizing immigrants. Uh, very many hotel, healthcare, hospital workers. Uh, uh, Many of them have large numbers of immigrant and some undocumented workers within these unions. So it's a multifaceted question here. Let me ask another one. Trump is imposing high tariffs on imports. How do you see this? Isn't it like stopping immigration, kind of like stopping imports of commodities that cheaper labor produced in foreign countries? No. Okay.
Yeah, so this is again the globalism problem, right? I think that one of the frustrations that many, going back to the Sesto San Giovanni example, part of the reason why, work left places like Sesto, yes, automation, but also because it was cheaper to do these things elsewhere. If it's cheaper to do things elsewhere, then you're going to see the, outflow of work. So the question is, how do you properly and reasonably get control of a national economy in a globalized world? No one has figured out the solution to that. But I'm sure that one solution to that is actually taking democratic control over your labor market. And I'm sure another solution to that is an industrial policy that can actually make sure that domestic industry is invested in a way that actually benefits the domestic population rather than constant deindustrialization, which is what we've seen in the United States over the last 50 years. So tariffs are going to be a part of that. I mean, I think Trump's tariffs are completely misguided, and he doesn't seem to really have a good grasp on how tariffs are meant to work. But I think tariffs have always been a part of the American economic strategy, and they've often been advocated by workers in steel and auto and other manufacturing industries that understand that you need to use this as a way of protecting both the hard-won gains of the shop floor organizing and the ability for your products to remain competitive.
Peter, you are
Yes. All
yeah.
right. Yeah, I'm there. My mouse hung up for a sec, so apologize for that. Uh, I would like to get since a number of our listeners have raised this issue of race and social class in terms of how people view immigration. The Hanging can, but uh, the poll that the Pew Research Center did on people's attitudes towards immigration showed that there was a vast divide in terms of people's social status and how they viewed immigration, um, particularly those with higher incomes, higher education, for example, um, postgraduates and college graduates were much less willing to support restrictions on immigration, whereas those who had a high school degree or less were 83% supported restricting immigration and sending undocumented workers back to their homes across the border. And this also was kind of replicated among African American and Latinos, who also had seemed to have a very low tolerance for illegal immigration. Do you see any, you did mention, this kind of what you termed the Brahmin left class of attitude toward immigration. Do you see this as a class perspective that really it's almost a working class perspective that wants restrictions, whereas those who are professionals, managerial class, leftists, or any other type of political persuasion, Democrat or Republican, of higher incomes and higher education that don't want to see restrictions? Is it really a class differentiation on attitudes?
I think there's definitely class interests at play, right? For many blue collar workers, especially those in construction, what they see, the effects that they see from immigration are a decrease in wages and standards. What many Brahmin voters see is an increase in the capacity for them to afford certain services. And so for those who are, have disposable income, professional class people with college degrees, the way immigration plays out in their economic lives is to have cheaper goods for them to buy and cheaper services for them to purchase. So it's very hard to separate these things in people's minds. I think, Marx was basically right when he said ideology is, the way in which you make sense of your economic interests in terms of political values. Well, that's why it's very hard for certain people on the left who are professional class to see their values as anything other than values, when really it can be a cover for their economic interests. In this case, not their productive interests, but their consumptive interests. So I think many people who are white collar workers living in large cities and espousing kind of open borders mindset, both their sort of cosmopolitan lifestyle suggests that this is the way the world should work, but also they are getting something out of this. They are getting cheaper services, cheaper goods that they themselves get to consume, right? To me, these things are not so easily separated. And it's one reason why you often find working class voters, even working class voters who are extremely opposed to ICE tactics, those who say that, we should have a path to citizenship, still have a divergence on the question of immigration from liberal professional class voters who still believe that, beyond the ICE stuff and beyond the path to citizenship, there should be even more liberal border questions, even more liberalized open borders. So I do think there's a class question here, and I think you see it over and over again in survey results.
Very good. I want to kind of bring things to a close now by asking one last question, and this is about the creation of a workers' party. The viewer wants to ask, what do you think of some of the trade unionists who are now calling for the creation of a workers' party? They criticize both Democrats and Republicans, but at the same time, they don't call for people to vote for any existing third party. What is your feeling of how this will develop? This calls for working class party.
Look, I think we live in a pretty unstable time. So the way in which political formations can develop is going to be an open question. I am in favor, I've said over and over again, I am in favor of working class interests being expressed politically. If those interests can be expressed politically in a new party, one that is viable and can win elections, that'd be a wonderful thing. I think it'd be good for the American political system to experience that. But if they are expressed by independents who call themselves populists, I think those deserve just as much support. The question is whether or not working class interests are genuinely being expressed politically. And where they are, I think people who are serious about working class politics need to be. Whether or not that gets expressed in the kind of classic workers' party, I'm not so sure. But I'm open to it. I mean, I think things are very in flux right now. America is not exactly in a stable point of its history. Things can change and they can change very quickly. I think we need to be aware of the possibilities of new parties, new organizations, and new forms of political action that develop.
Okay. I'm glad to hear that because I really kind of agree with that. Dino, it's been a great experience having you here. I want to thank you very much for coming. We really appreciate you. We appreciate your bringing your words of wisdom and a really, really refreshing and interesting perspective on immigration. Again, we don't really hear a lot of debate on this particular question. We hear debate between the poles, but nothing in the middle. And I'm really happy to hear you, getting out and presenting your views. I also want to remind everybody to please sign up for notices so you get our weekly emails about our sessions. Go to ICSSmarks.org. And with that, we want to bring the session to close, and please come back again next week and the week after. We're looking forward to hearing all your views of our listeners and sharing with everybody our political discussions on Marx and the working class. Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.